You cut your finger. A red drop wells up. You've seen this 1,000 times, but the color itself is strange. Blood could have been blue. It could have been green, violet, or colorless. For most of the animal kingdom, it still is. The red you're looking at is iron oxide, the same chemistry that turns a nail to rust, the same reaction that stains the surface of Mars. You are watching controlled oxidation happen inside your body in real time. But blood wasn't always red, and for most of Earth's history, blood didn't exist at all. The story of how it appeared, why it looks the way it does, and how a waste disposal protein became the delivery system for complex life is older than trees, older than bones, and involves more accidents than anyone wants to admit. For the first 3 billion years of life on Earth, nothing had a heartbeat. Bacteria drifted in the primordial soup. Algal mats clung to rocks. Early multicellular organisms spread across the seafloor like living quilts. None of them needed circulation because none of them were thick enough to require it. Physics set the rules. Oxygen dissolved in water can diffuse through a cell membrane and reach the interior, but only if the distance is short. The limit is roughly 1 millimeter. Beyond that thickness, the oxygen molecules can't penetrate fast enough. The cells in the center suffocate before the next molecule arrives. This is the diffusion cage, and it constrained the shape of early life absolutely. The Ediacaran biota, living between 600 and 540 million years ago, show what this constraint demanded. Fossils from Mistaken Point in Newfoundland and the Flinders Ranges in Australia preserve creatures that look like ferns, fronds, and quilted air mattresses. They were flat. Some were paper thin, others were hollow tubes or branching structures that maximize surface area while keeping interior volume minimal. A few looked like discs with radial ridges, anything to ensure that no cell was ever more than a millimeter from the surrounding water. Natural selection is the process by which organisms with traits better suited to their environment survive and reproduce more successfully. Genetic mutations introduce variation. If a mutation provides an advantage, it spreads. For 3 billion years, mutations that made organisms thicker were lethal. Diffusion was the ceiling, and evolution couldn't break it with incremental changes alone. Life needed a new mechanism. Around 600 million years ago, something changed. Predation appeared. Organisms began eating each other, and an arms race started. To avoid being eaten, you needed to be larger. To eat others, you needed to be larger still. But larger bodies can't rely on diffusion. The constraint remained absolute. The solution was bulk flow, fluid transport driven by pressure differences rather than passive diffusion. Early circulatory systems were crude. A muscular tube contracted rhythmically, pushing whatever fluid filled the body cavity through primitive channels. This wasn't blood yet. It was hemolymph, interstitial fluid, anything that could move. The primary cargo was nutrients, hormones, and waste. Oxygen was a passenger, dissolving in the fluid incidentally. The invention of the pump bypassed the diffusion limit entirely. Thickness no longer mattered. A worm could be a centimeter wide. A proto-arthropod could grow an exoskeleton, and the cells at the core would still receive supplies. The Cambrian Explosion followed within tens of millions of years. Body plans diversified. Predators developed claws, armor, and compound eyes. None of this was possible under the diffusion regime, but pumping plain fluid has limits. Oxygen doesn't dissolve well in water. A high metabolism organism, one that moves quickly, hunts actively, and processes food fast, needs more oxygen than simple circulation can provide. Evolution needed a way to concentrate oxygen in the fluid itself to pack more cargo into every drop. The answer was chemistry. Proteins can bind to metal ions. If the metal changes its electron configuration when it encounters oxygen, the protein can hold that oxygen molecule temporarily and release it elsewhere. This is the principle behind all respiratory pigments, and evolution tried it with multiple metals simultaneously. Hemocyanin uses copper. When oxygenated, copper-based blood turns blue. When deoxygenated, it becomes colorless. Arthropods, crabs, lobsters, spiders, and many mollusks, including octopuses, use this system. The copper atoms float freely in the hemolymph rather than being contained in cells. This works, but it has a viscosity problem. High concentrations of hemocyanin make the fluid thick and slow. Pumping it requires more energy, and the oxygen carrying capacity plateaus. Chlorocruorin uses iron, but with a slightly modified heme structure compared to hemoglobin. It appears green in dilute concentrations and light red when concentrated. Only certain marine polychaete worms use it, and they live in environments with fluctuating oxygen levels, tidal mudflats, estuaries, shallow burrows. The pigment handles variability well, but isn't efficient enough for active, fast-moving life. Hemerythrin also uses iron, but without the porphyrin ring structure that defines heme. It binds oxygen directly to two iron atoms. The result is a violet or pink color when oxygenated. Brachiopods, also called lamp shells, and a handful of marine worms called peanut worms use hemerythrin. These organisms are evolutionary relics. Brachiopods were once abundant in Paleozoic seas, but are now marginal, outcompeted by mollusks and other groups. The pigment works, but it's far less efficient than hemoglobin. Hemoglobin uses iron embedded in a porphyrin ring. Oxygenated, it's bright red. Deoxygenated, it shifts to dark red or purplish. Vertebrates use it almost exclusively, but so do some annelid worms, a few species of insects, and even some plants. It became the dominant solution because it's more efficient than the alternatives, capable of carrying more oxygen per unit of protein, and releasing it more precisely where it's needed. We know these systems were operational over 500 million years ago because we can see them in fossils. The Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies preserves soft-bodied organisms from the Cambrian period, around 508 million years ago. Researchers using X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy mapped the distribution of elements in fossilized arthropods. In specimens of Morea splendens, a small shrimp-like creature with distinctive spines, they found concentrated copper, exactly where the cardiovascular system would have been. The hemocyanin decomposed, but the metal remained. The stain is a chemical ghost, proof that blue blood was already circulating before the first vertebrate appeared. The horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, has carried blue blood for 450 million years. Its hemocyanin-based system has remained largely unchanged across that span, surviving 4 mass extinctions. The blood has one unusual property that makes it valuable to modern medicine. It contains a clotting agent called Limulus amebocyte lysate, which solidifies instantly when exposed to bacterial endotoxins. Pharmaceutical companies harvest horseshoe crab blood to test medical equipment and vaccines for contamination. A single quart of the blue fluid can sell for $15,000. The crabs are bled and released, though a percentage die from the procedure. An immune system adaptation that evolved to protect against Paleozoic infections now serves as a quality control mechanism for human medicine. Hemoglobin didn't start as an oxygen transporter. It started as a defense mechanism. Oxygen is reactive. It strips electrons from other molecules, creating what biochemists call reactive oxygen species, peroxides, superoxides, hydroxyl radicals. These compounds damage DNA, proteins, and cell membranes. For early anaerobic life, oxygen was poison. When cyanobacteria began producing oxygen as a waste product during photosynthesis, it triggered a mass extinction. The survivors were organisms that could tolerate oxygen or neutralize it before it caused harm. The Great Oxidation Event occurred roughly 2.4 billion years ago. Cyanobacteria had been photosynthesizing for hundreds of millions of years prior, but the oxygen they produced was absorbed by iron dissolved in the ocean, forming rust deposits that sank to the seafloor. These banded iron formations are visible today in rock strata across every continent. Eventually, the oceans are saturated. No more dissolved iron remained to soak up the oxygen. The gas escaped into the atmosphere. Oxygen levels rose from near zero to a few percent over the course of perhaps 100 million years. For anaerobic organisms that had dominated the planet for over 1 billion years, this was catastrophic. Oxygen burned through their cellular machinery. Most lineages died out. Globins are ancient proteins. They appear in bacteria, plants, fungi, and animals. The original function was likely scavenging free oxygen and locking it away before it could oxidize sensitive cellular machinery. The protein would bind an oxygen molecule, hold it in a chemically inert state, and eventually release it harmlessly, or pass it to another protein for disposal. This was waste management, not respiration. At some point between 600 and 500 million years ago, evolution co-opted the system. If the protein was already grabbing oxygen, it could release that oxygen somewhere useful, near mitochondria, for example, where cells generate energy. The waste disposal protein became a delivery service. The mutation that enabled this shift wasn't a dramatic redesign. It was a change in where and when the protein released its cargo. The breakthrough came from a genetic accident. Whole genome duplication is a rare event where an organism's entire set of genes gets copied, sometimes due to errors in cell division. Around 500 to 600 million years ago, this happened in the ancestor of vertebrates. The gene for the simple globin protein was duplicated. One copy became the alpha globin gene, another became the beta globin gene. These two different proteins could bind to each other. 4 chains, 2 alpha, 2 beta, assembled into a single complex structure, a tetramer. This 4-part molecule had a property the single chain version lacked: cooperativity. When one subunit binds an oxygen molecule, it changes shape slightly. That shape change makes it easier for the next subunit to bind oxygen. The 4th oxygen binds more readily than the first. The system is self-accelerating. In an oxygen-rich environment like the lungs or gills, hemoglobin loads up rapidly. In an oxygen-poor environment like working muscle tissue, it releases oxygen efficiently. This wasn't intelligent design. It was repurposing, duplication, and a structural quirk that turned out to be advantageous. Hemoglobin became the most efficient respiratory pigment by accident. Hemoglobin is a large protein. If you dissolved enough of it directly into blood plasma to support a high metabolism animal, the fluid would thicken into something closer to syrup than liquid. The heart couldn't pump it. Vessels would clog. Circulation would fail. Vertebrates solved this by locking hemoglobin inside cells. Red blood cells, or erythrocytes, are specialized containers. The hemoglobin is packed inside at high concentrations, while the surrounding plasma remains thin and easy to pump. This compartmentalization allows blood to carry massive amounts of oxygen without becoming viscous. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds all use red blood cells, but their cells retain a nucleus. If you look at frog blood under a microscope, each cell has a dark central spot, the nucleus, containing the DNA. The cells can repair themselves, divide, and maintain their internal machinery over time. Mammals did something different. During development in the bone marrow, mammalian red blood cells eject their nucleus before entering the bloodstream. They also discard their mitochondria and most other organelles. What enters circulation is essentially a sack of hemoglobin with a flexible membrane and a few enzymes to maintain the structure. The advantage is size and flexibility. Without a nucleus taking up space, the cell can be smaller. Without rigid internal structures, it can deform, folding and squeezing through capillaries that are narrower than the cell's resting diameter. Mammals have extreme capillary networks necessary for distributing heat and oxygen in warm-blooded, high-metabolism bodies. The cells needed to be deformable to navigate those networks. The trade-off is lifespan. A mammalian red blood cell can't repair damage or reproduce. It circulates for roughly 120 days before it breaks down and gets filtered out by the spleen. The bone marrow compensates by producing 2 to 3 million new cells every second. You are constantly replacing your blood. The heart and circulatory system co-evolved with blood chemistry. Fish have 2-chambered hearts, 1 atrium, 1 ventricle. Blood flows in a single loop, heart to gills, to body to heart. Pressure drops significantly after passing through the gills, so circulation is relatively slow. Amphibians have 3 chambers, 2 atria, 1 ventricle. This allows partial separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, but the single ventricle still mixes them to some degree. It's inefficient, but sufficient for cold-blooded animals with lower metabolic demands. Reptiles have a 3-chambered heart with a partial wall, or septum, dividing the ventricle. Mixing is reduced. Some reptiles, like crocodilians, have a nearly complete 4-chambered system. Birds and mammals independently evolved fully separated 4-chambered hearts. Oxygenated blood from the lungs never mixes with deoxygenated blood returning from the body. This complete separation is essential for sustaining high metabolic rates and constant body temperature. The efficiency of the blood and the efficiency of the pump are inseparable. Each advance in one system required a corresponding advance in the other, but a high-pressure closed system introduced a new vulnerability. Leaks became catastrophic. A breach in a diffusion-based organism is inconvenient. A breach in a pressurized circulatory system causes rapid depressurization and death. Evolution addressed this with clotting. The clotting cascade is a chain reaction involving at least 12 different proteins, most of which are serine proteases, enzymes that cut other proteins. Factor 12 activates factor 11. Factor 11 activates factor 9. The sequence continues through multiple steps until fibrinogen, a soluble protein floating in the plasma, is converted into fibrin, an insoluble protein that forms a mesh. The mesh traps blood cells and forms a solid plug. The complexity exists for a reason. If clotting activated too easily, clots would form inside intact vessels, blocking circulation and causing strokes or heart attacks. The cascade requires multiple simultaneous triggers: exposed collagen from damaged vessel walls, activated platelets, specific chemical signals to initiate. It's a fail-safe system. Many of the proteins involved in clotting are evolutionarily related to digestive enzymes. Evolution repurposed proteins originally used to break down food in the gut, to break down and reorganize proteins in the blood, turning liquid into solid at the site of injury. Mammals pushed the system further. Enucleated red blood cells are one part of the optimization. The other is precision targeting. Hemoglobin doesn't just dump oxygen randomly. It responds to chemical signals in the surrounding tissue. The mechanism is called the Bohr effect, named after the physiologist Christian Bohr, who described it in 1904. When cells work hard, muscle cells during exercise, for example, they produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of metabolism. Carbon dioxide dissolves in blood, forming carbonic acid, which lowers the pH. Hemoglobin is sensitive to pH. In an acidic environment, its affinity for oxygen decreases. The molecule changes shape slightly and releases its oxygen cargo. This means oxygen is delivered precisely where it's needed most, in tissues that are metabolically active and producing acid. Resting tissues, which produce less carbon dioxide and maintain a higher pH, receive less oxygen. The system self-regulates without requiring conscious control. The scale of the modern human circulatory system reflects 700 million years of incremental improvements. An average adult has roughly 25 trillion red blood cells in circulation at any given moment. Each cell completes a full circuit of the body in 20 to 60 seconds. If you laid out all the blood vessels end to end, the total length would exceed 60,000 miles, enough to wrap around the Earth more than twice. The vessel network branches into progressively smaller tubes. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. They divide into arterioles, which divide into capillaries. Capillaries are so narrow that red blood cells must travel single file, often deforming to squeeze through. The walls are 1 cell thick, allowing oxygen and nutrients to diffuse into surrounding tissues. Deoxygenated blood then flows into venules, which merge into veins, which return blood to the heart. The entire system operates under pressure gradients maintained by the heart's rhythmic contractions, beating roughly 100,000 times per day. Bone marrow continuously produces new cells to replace the ones that wear out. The production rate is staggering, 2 to 3 million cells every second. Over a human lifetime, the marrow will generate roughly 500 kilograms of red blood cells, despite the fact that only about 5 liters are in circulation at any time. The system is a conveyor belt, constantly refreshing. Stem cells in the marrow divide and differentiate, passing through several intermediate stages before ejecting their nuclei and entering the bloodstream. The process takes about 7 days from stem cell to mature erythrocyte. When old cells break down, the iron from their hemoglobin is recycled. The liver and spleen filter out the damaged cells, extract the iron, and return it to the marrow for reuse. Nothing is wasted. The story of blood isn't linear progress. It's adaptation to specific environments, and sometimes those environments render even the most sophisticated systems unnecessary. 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen spiked to around 35% compared to 21% today. The cause was an explosion of plant life, vast coal swamps covering the continents, photosynthesizing at a scale never seen before or since. Oxygen flooded the atmosphere. Arthropods, which rely on hemocyanin and a tracheal breathing system rather than lungs, suddenly had access to far more oxygen than their bodies were designed to handle. The inefficiency of their respiratory system stopped mattering. Oxygen was everywhere. They grew. Meganeura was a dragonfly with a wingspan approaching 75 centimeters. Arthropleura was a millipede longer than a human is tall, possibly exceeding 2 meters. These creatures were only possible because the atmosphere was force-feeding them oxygen. Their hemocyanin-based blood and simple tracheal tubes, which would have been limiting in a normal oxygen environment, were sufficient in a hyperoxic one. When oxygen levels dropped back to normal ranges, the giants went extinct. Their bodies couldn't extract enough oxygen from the thinner air. Hemoglobin-using vertebrates, with their more efficient oxygen transport and closed circulatory systems, inherited the niches the arthropods had occupied. The rise and fall of the Carboniferous giants wasn't about superior design, it was about environmental fit. The Antarctic blackfin icefish, Channichthyidae axaratus, demonstrates the opposite extreme. It lives in the Southern Ocean, where water temperatures hover around -2 degrees Celsius. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water. The icefish doesn't need hemoglobin. In fact, hemoglobin is a disadvantage. Cold makes blood more viscous. Adding millions of red blood cells would thicken the blood further, increasing the workload on the heart. At some point in the icefish's evolutionary history, a mutation disabled the gene responsible for producing hemoglobin. In any other environment, this would be lethal. In the oxygen-saturated Antarctic, it was beneficial. The blood became thinner and easier to pump. The fish survived. We know this was a loss rather than a primitive condition because we can sequence the icefish genome and find the remnants of the hemoglobin gene. It's still there. Broken and non-functional, a pseudogene. Pseudogenes are molecular fossils. They prove that the icefish's ancestors had hemoglobin and that the current species lost it. Evolution ran backward. The icefish has clear blood. If you cut one open, the fluid that spills out looks like water with a faint yellowish tint. It still circulates nutrients, hormones, and waste, but it carries no respiratory pigment. Oxygen diffuses directly from the water into the tissues through the skin and gills. The fish compensates for the lack of hemoglobin with an enlarged heart, a larger blood volume, and capillaries that penetrate deeper into tissues than in most fish. The skin lacks scales, making it more permeable to oxygen. The gills have a larger surface area. Every adaptation serves to maximize oxygen uptake without using respiratory pigments. The fish has returned, in a sense, to the diffusion-based system that governed life 3 billion years ago. The difference is scale and context. The icefish can afford to rely on diffusion because its environment is so rich in oxygen and because its metabolism, being cold-blooded, is low enough that diffusion suffices. Blood is not a story of inevitable progress toward a single optimal solution. It's a story of trade-offs, accidents, and environmental pressures that favor different solutions in different contexts. The blue blood of a horseshoe crab, unchanged for 450 million years, works as well for that animal as the red blood of a human works for us. The clear blood of an icefish works better in Antarctic waters than hemoglobin ever could. You carry an ocean inside you. The salt concentration of your blood plasma matches, within a few percentage points, the salinity of the ancient seas where the first circulatory systems evolved. Every heartbeat is an echo of the Cambrian, when the first primitive hearts began pumping fluid through the first primitive vessels. The iron in your hemoglobin was forged in a supernova billions of years before the Earth existed, pulled into a planetary disk, incorporated into rock, dissolved in water, absorbed by early life, and eventually locked into a protein that your ancestors co-opted from a detoxification system. Blood wasn't designed. It was scavenged, duplicated, repurposed, optimized, and occasionally discarded. It's a jury-rigged solution to the problem of moving oxygen from one place to another, built from whatever molecular tools evolution had lying around at the time. And it works. Not bad for a broken waste disposal system that learned to deliver the mail.